The massive doors of the Grand Assembly Hall groaned open with a sound that echoed across 3 star systems. Ambassador David Kane stepped through the threshold and felt his breath catch in his throat. The chamber before him defied every law of architecture he understood. Crystalline walls stretched upward into infinity, their surfaces alive with flowing patterns of light that pulsed in rhythm with the heartbeats of 1,000 different species. Hundreds of alien beings filled the tiered seating that spiraled around the central floor. Kane recognized some from the diplomatic briefings: the towering Xanthari with their blue-scaled skin and multiple arms, the floating ethereals whose bodies seemed made of pure energy, the insectoid Kythera with their clicking mandibles and compound eyes. But most of the creatures before him were beyond human comprehension, beings so alien that his mind struggled to process their forms. At the apex of the chamber sat the Council of 12, the most powerful entities in known space. Each represented billions of years of evolution and technological advancement. Their very presence warped the air around them, creating visual distortions that made Kane's eyes water. The floor beneath his feet was transparent, revealing the void of space below. Through it, he could see the massive structure of the Council Station, an artificial world the size of Jupiter, built from the cores of dead stars and powered by contained black holes. Fleets from 100 worlds surrounded it, their weapons trained on the tiny human shuttle that had brought him here. Kane forced himself to walk forward, his simple diplomatic uniform a stark contrast to the ornate robes and biomechanical armor surrounding him. Every step echoed in the vast chamber, and he could feel thousands of alien eyes tracking his movement. Some showed curiosity, others contempt, but most displayed a cold calculation that made his skin crawl. He reached the speaking circle at the center of the hall and stopped. The silence was absolute, pressing against him like a physical weight. Above him, the Council of 12 leaned forward in their impossibly tall chairs, their attention focused on the lone human with an intensity that had reduced other species to madness. The first to speak was Prime Adjudicator Roxas of the Xanthari, his voice booming through both audible frequencies and psychic channels that made Kane's skull ache. The being known as David Kane, representing the species called humans, stands before this council to answer for crimes against galactic order. Kane remained silent, following the advice of his briefing officers. Let them speak first. Let them reveal their position before showing your hand. Counselor Vexa of the Ethereals drifted closer, her energy form shifting through colors that had no names in any human language. Your species has violated the sacred boundaries, human. You have claimed star systems without permission, established colonies without authorization, and refused to submit to proper genetic classification. The charges continued for what felt like hours. Kane listened to accusations of territorial expansion, technological development without oversight, and the ultimate crime, refusing to acknowledge council authority over human affairs. With each word, the assembled aliens grew more agitated, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony of sounds, lights, and psychic emanations that threatened to overwhelm his senses. Finally, the chamber fell silent again. Prime Adjudicator Roxas raised one of his forearms, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute authority. The penalty for these crimes is complete species termination. Your homeworld will be sterilized, your colonies dissolved, and your genetic line removed from the galactic record. Do you have any final words before sentence is carried out? This was the moment Kane had trained for his entire life. The moment that would determine whether humanity survived or joined the countless other species that had been erased from existence for defying the Council's will. He took a deep breath and spoke in a voice that carried clearly through the vast chamber. Honored counselors, I request the right to present evidence before you pass judgment. A ripple of surprise went through the assembled aliens. Most species simply begged for mercy at this point. Some offered tribute or submission. None had ever requested to present evidence. Roxas leaned back in his massive chair, and Kane could have sworn he saw amusement in the alien's multifaceted eyes. Evidence? What evidence could possibly justify your species' blatant disregard for galactic law? Kane reached into his diplomatic pouch and withdrew a small device, a quantum storage unit that contained information gathered over decades of secret observation. Evidence that everything you believe about humanity is wrong, counselor. Evidence that your own laws have been violated on a scale that dwarfs anything my species has done. The chamber erupted in chaos. Alien voices rose in dozens of languages. Energy fields crackled with agitation, and several species began powering up personal weapons. The council guards, massive beings in powered armor, stepped forward with weapons that could level mountains. But Roxas raised his hand again, and silence fell like a hammer blow. "Explain yourself, human, quickly." Kane activated the device and holographic displays materialized around the chamber. The images showed star charts, military records, and biological data that made several council members shift uncomfortably in their seats. But it was the final image that caused the real shock. A detailed scan of Earth itself, revealing technological signatures that should have been impossible for a species at humanity's supposed development level. "For the past 50 years, Kane began, his voice steady despite the death sentence hanging over his species, humanity has been conducting a comprehensive study of galactic civilization. We have observed your expansion patterns, analyzed your technological capabilities, and documented your treatment of species that refuse to submit to council authority." He gestured to the displays, which showed the locations of extinct civilizations across the galaxy. "In the last 1,000 years, the Council has eliminated 437 species for the crime of independent development. Each one was charged with the same violations you've accused humanity of committing." Councillor Vex's energy form flickered with what might have been concern. Those species were offered the choice of integration or termination. "They chose poorly, did they?" Kane's question cut through the chamber like a blade. "Or were they eliminated because they developed technology that threatened Council supremacy?" The holographic displays shifted, showing detailed analysis of the extinct species' technological achievements. In every case, they had been destroyed just as they achieved breakthrough discoveries that could have changed the balance of power in the galaxy. "You see, counselors," Kane continued, "humanity made a different choice when we discovered your existence. Instead of announcing ourselves and requesting integration, we decided to watch and learn. We wanted to understand exactly what we were dealing with before making contact." Prime Adjudicator Roxas leaned forward, his massive form casting shadows across the chamber floor. "And what did you learn, human?" Kane smiled, an expression that somehow seemed more predatory than reassuring. "We learned that the Council maintains its power through technological suppression, genetic manipulation, and the systematic elimination of potential rivals. We learned that galactic law exists solely to preserve your authority, not to maintain peace or justice." He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering the statement that would change everything. "Most importantly, we learned that humanity possesses something no other species in this galaxy has ever had when facing the Council." The chamber held its breath, waiting for his next words. "We learned that we have a choice." The silence that followed Kane's declaration stretched across the chamber like a living thing. The assembled aliens leaned forward in their seats, their various sensory organs focused on the lone human with an intensity that should have reduced him to ash. But Kane stood firm, his hand still resting on the quantum storage device that contained 50 years of human intelligence gathering. Prime Adjudicator Roxas was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying harmonics that made the crystalline walls vibrate. "You speak of choice as if it were something new, human. Every species that has stood in this chamber had the same choice: submit to galactic order or face extinction." Kane shook his head slowly. "No, Counselor. They had an ultimatum, not a choice. A choice requires multiple viable options." He activated another sequence on his device, and the holographic displays around the chamber shifted to show tactical assessments that made several council members step backward in shock. The images revealed the true scope of human expansion across the galaxy. What the Council had identified as primitive colonies were actually sophisticated research stations. What they had classified as territorial violations were strategic positioning of assets across dozens of star systems. And at the center of it all was Earth itself, revealed not as a simple homeworld but as a fortress that defied every principle of planetary engineering the Council understood. "For 50 years, Kane continued, his voice echoing in the vast chamber, humanity has been preparing for this conversation. We have studied your military capabilities, analyzed your political structures, and identified the fundamental weaknesses in your system of control." Councillor Vex's energy form flickered with rapid color changes that indicated extreme agitation. "Impossible. Our surveillance networks monitor all developing species. No civilization can achieve interstellar capability without our knowledge. That assumption is your first weakness." Kane replied calmly. Your surveillance networks are designed to detect the technological signatures you expect. Hyperspace distortions, energy emissions, communication frequencies that match your own understanding of physics. Human technology developed along completely different lines. The displays updated to show comparative technology analyses. Where other species used brute force energy projection, humans had learned to manipulate space-time itself. Where others broadcast communications across subspace frequencies, humans used quantum entanglement networks that existed outside normal dimensional boundaries. Where others built ships that fought through obstacles, humans created vessels that simply redefined what obstacles meant. A new voice joined the conversation. Counselor Theiss of the Kythera, his clicking mandibles creating words in the universal translation matrix. Even if your technology differs from expected patterns, you are still bound by the fundamental laws of galactic civilization. No species can challenge the authority of this council and survive. Kane's smile grew sharper. Counselor Theiss, your own military records show that the Kythera swarm has never faced an enemy they couldn't overwhelm through numerical superiority. Your entire combat doctrine is based on deploying millions of fighters against enemies who play by the same rules you do. He gestured to the displays, which now showed real-time tactical information that made the Kythera representative step backward in alarm. Around every major Kythera military installation, space itself seemed to shimmer with barely visible distortions. What happens to numerical superiority when the enemy can attack from directions that don't exist in your three-dimensional understanding of space? Kane asked. What happens when your millions of fighters are shooting at targets that exist primarily in parallel dimensions? The chamber erupted in chaos as the implications became clear. Military advisors from dozens of species began frantically checking their instruments, trying to detect the human forces that the displays claimed were already in position around their homeworlds. But their sensors showed nothing unusual, exactly as Kane had predicted. This is the second weakness of your system, Kane announced over the growing tumult. You've become so accustomed to absolute superiority that you have forgotten how to adapt to genuinely new threats. For 12,000 years, you have faced only enemies who use technology derived from your own scientific principles. You have never encountered a species that developed completely independently. Prime Adjudicator Roxas slammed his fist against his chair's armrest, creating a sound like thunder. Enough. Even if these claims are true, you are still outnumbered 1,000,000-1. The combined fleets of the Council represent the military might of 10,000 worlds. Kane nodded thoughtfully. An impressive force, Counselor. Completely useless against an enemy you cannot see, cannot predict, and cannot engage on terms you understand, but impressive nonetheless. The displays shifted again, this time showing the Council station itself from a perspective that made several aliens gasp in shock. The massive structure was surrounded by geometric patterns that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, creating optical illusions that hurt to look at directly. Those aren't ships, whispered Commander Zelta of the Ethereal Guard, her energy form pulsing with frequencies that indicated fear. No, Kane agreed. There's something entirely new. Human war constructs that exist across 7 parallel dimensional layers simultaneously. Your weapons fire at 3-dimensional targets while the real threat remains safely outside your ability to perceive or engage. He turned to address the Council directly. This brings us to your third weakness, your assumption that all conflicts must be resolved through military action. You see a threat, you deploy overwhelming force, the threat is eliminated. Simple, effective, and completely inadequate when facing an enemy that redefines the rules of engagement. Counselor Vexa drifted closer, her form now cycling through colors that spoke of confusion and growing desperation. What do you want, human? What are your terms? Kane's expression grew serious. We want what every species in this galaxy should have had from the beginning. The right to exist without your permission, to develop without your oversight, and to chart our own course among the stars without bowing to your authority. And if we refuse? Roxas asked, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. Then you will learn firsthand why the last 3 species that declared war on humanity are no longer part of this galaxy. Kane replied matter-of-factly. The Vicari thought their bioweapons could infect human worlds. They discovered that our immune systems operate on principles their science couldn't comprehend. The Deltans believed their psychic abilities could break human minds. They learned that human consciousness exists in dimensional layers they couldn't access. The Gorthak were convinced their superior technology would ensure victory. They never understood that superiority is meaningless when you're fighting an enemy that uses completely different rules. The chamber fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. In the viewing galleries, representatives from minor species began to murmur among themselves, and Kane caught fragments of conversation that suggested not all of the council's subjects were entirely loyal. "Here's what will happen," Kane announced, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space. "The council will vote on humanity's proposal for a new galactic confederation based on voluntary cooperation rather than forced submission. Those who choose to join this confederation will find themselves part of a truly collaborative civilization. Those who choose to maintain the old system of domination will find themselves increasingly isolated as more species embrace freedom." He deactivated the display device and tucked it back into his pouch. "You have 24 hours to make your decision. After that, humanity will begin implementing our own vision for galactic civilization, with or without council approval." As Kane turned to leave the chamber, Prime Adjudicator Roxas called after him. "And if we choose war, human? If we decide that your species must be eliminated regardless of the cost?" Kane paused at the massive doors and looked back at the assembled council. "Then you will discover why defeat seemed inevitable until humanity declared war on the galaxy." 20 hours had passed since Kane's ultimatum, and the Grand Assembly Hall buzzed with tension that could be felt across dimensional barriers. Emergency sessions had convened throughout the night as species representatives contacted their homeworlds. Military commanders activated ancient defense protocols, and scientists desperately tried to develop countermeasures for threats they couldn't understand. The chamber doors opened with their characteristic groan, and Kane returned to find the hall transformed. Where before there had been an atmosphere of confident authority, now there was barely controlled panic. Many of the minor species representatives looked exhausted, their various physiologies showing clear signs of stress. Even the mighty Council of 12 seemed diminished, their imposing forms somehow less overwhelming than they had been the day before. Prime Adjudicator Roxas rose from his throne, his forearms spread wide in a gesture of authority that no longer carried its previous weight. "The Council has reached a decision, human. We reject your demands and choose to maintain galactic order through time-tested methods." A murmur of anticipation ran through the assembled aliens. Some species had backed the Council's decision, believing their combined might could overcome any single civilization. Others had remained neutral, waiting to see which side would prove stronger. A few had already begun sending discreet messages to human diplomatic channels, suggesting they might be willing to negotiate separately. Kane nodded as if he had expected this response. "I understand, Counselor. Before we proceed, I should inform you that humanity has spent the last 20 hours conducting final preparations for this outcome." He activated his communication device, and new holographic displays materialized around the chamber. These showed real-time images from across the galaxy that made even the most confident Council supporters fall silent in shock. The displays revealed the true scope of human preparation. Every major Council world was surrounded by the same geometric impossibilities that had appeared around the station. Military installations that had stood unconquered for millennia found themselves facing enemies that existed just outside their ability to perceive or engage. Trade routes that had operated for thousands of years were now monitored by human constructs that could intercept or redirect traffic at will. "The Zenthari homeworld," Kane announced, indicating one of the displays. 7 billion inhabitants, defended by orbital platforms that have never been breached in 3,000 years of continuous operation. The image showed the massive blue planet with its ring of defensive stations. But surrounding everything were the telltale distortions of human war constructs, geometric patterns that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "Counselor Roxas, would you like to attempt to contact your homeworld?" The Zenthari leader activated his personal communication system and attempted to establish a link with Zenthari Prime. Nothing happened. He tried again, cycling through emergency frequencies and backup channels. Still nothing. "Communication interdiction," Kane explained calmly. "Your homeworld is completely cut off from the galactic communication network. They can see the human constructs surrounding their planet, but they cannot call for help, cannot coordinate with your fleets, and cannot receive orders from this council. He gestured to another display showing the ethereal territories. The same situation exists across all council space. Every world, every station, every ship is now operating in complete isolation. Counselor Vexa's energy form flickered through colors that spoke of rage and desperation. This is an act of war. The combined fleets of the galaxy will do what exactly? Kane interrupted. Your combined fleets cannot engage enemies they cannot see. Your weapons cannot target constructs that exist primarily in parallel dimensions. Your tactics are useless against an enemy that operates by completely different rules. As if to prove his point, the displays updated to show actual engagements occurring across the galaxy. Kythera swarm fleets were firing millions of rounds at empty space, while human constructs eliminated their ships one by one from directions that didn't exist in three-dimensional space. Ethereal energy beings found their most powerful attacks passing harmlessly through targets that were somehow both present and absent simultaneously. Commander Zelta of the Ethereal Guard stepped forward, her form pulsing with combat frequencies. If we cannot fight your constructs directly, we will target your homeworld. Earth will burn under the combined might of the Council fleets. Kane's smile grew sharper. Commander, I admire your tactical thinking. Unfortunately, you're making the same mistake every other species has made when facing humanity. The central display shifted to show Earth itself, revealed in all its impossible complexity. The planet existed not just in normal space but across multiple dimensional layers simultaneously. Around it, human defensive constructs formed patterns that defied geometric logic, creating barriers that existed in 7 parallel realities at once. Earth isn't just our homeworld, Commander. It's a fortress that exists across dimensional boundaries your science cannot even detect, let alone breach. Any attack on Earth would have to succeed simultaneously across 7 different layers of reality. He gestured to tactical analyses that made the alien military officers step backward in alarm. Your combined fleets represent impressive firepower in 3-dimensional space. But what happens when the target exists primarily in dimensions you cannot access? Counselor Thys of the Kythera clicked forward aggressively. Even if we cannot reach your homeworld directly, we can eliminate every human colony, every outpost, every ship. You cannot protect everything, can't we? Kane asked mildly. Commander Thys, your military intelligence has identified 17 human colonies across the galaxy. Unfortunately, that represents less than 2% of our actual presence. The displays updated again, showing the true extent of human expansion. Where the Council had detected 17 colonies, there were actually thousands of installations spread across hundreds of star systems. Most existed in dimensional spaces that paralleled normal reality without intersecting it, making them effectively invisible to conventional detection methods. For 50 years, humanity has been building a civilization that exists primarily outside your ability to perceive it. Kane explained. What you see as human territory is just the tiny fraction we deliberately allowed you to detect. The revelation hit the chamber like a physical blow. If human colonies were that numerous and that well hidden, if their defensive capabilities were that advanced, if their technology operated on principles the Council couldn't understand, then the balance of power in the galaxy had already shifted fundamentally. Prime Adjudicator Roxas slumped in his throne, his massive form somehow diminished. What do you want from us, human? Complete surrender? Kane shook his head. We want something much more dangerous than surrender, Counselor. We want you to change. Vexa's energy form flickered with confusion. The Council system is based on the assumption that only a few species are capable of true advancement, Kane explained. You maintain power by preventing others from reaching their full potential. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if every species in this galaxy could achieve greatness if given the opportunity? He gestured to the displays one final time. Humanity isn't here to conquer the galaxy, Counselors. We're here to liberate it. Every species currently under Council control will be given the choice to govern themselves. Every civilization that has been suppressed will be free to develop its own technology. Every being that has been classified as inferior will have the chance to prove otherwise. The chamber erupted in chaos as the implications became clear. The minor species representatives began talking excitedly among themselves, many looking toward the Council members with new understanding. If humanity could offer them genuine independence, genuine freedom to develop their own civilizations, why should they remain loyal to a system that had kept them subjugated for millennia? You have 6 hours to make your final decision. Kane announced over the growing tumult. After that, humanity will begin the process of galactic liberation, with or without Council cooperation. As he turned to leave, Roxas called after him one last time. And if we choose to fight to the end? If we refuse to accept this new order you propose? Kane paused at the doorway and looked back at the assembled council. Then you will discover that sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies, Counselor. Sometimes it's helping them become something better than they ever imagined possible. 6 hours later, the Grand Assembly Hall bore witness to something unprecedented in 12,000 years of galactic history. The Council of 12, the most powerful beings in known space, sat in their towering chairs and formally surrendered to a single human diplomat, but not all of them. The chamber was divided now, both literally and figuratively. Half of the Council species had chosen to accept humanity's terms for galactic liberation. Their representatives sat quietly, many looking relieved that the burden of absolute power was finally being lifted from their shoulders. The other half remained defiant, their military commanders flanking them in preparation for a war they still believed they could win. Prime Adjudicator Roxas stood at the center of this division, his massive form casting shadows across the transparent floor. The Zenthari Empire will never bow to a species that emerged from primitive conditions mere centuries ago. We have ruled the stars for millennia. We will not abandon our responsibilities now. Beside him, Counselor Thias clicked his agreement. The Kithara swarm stands with the Zenthari. Order must be maintained. The chaos you propose will destroy everything we have built. 3 other Council species had joined their resistance: the Hegemony, the Void Walkers, and the Silicon Consciousness. Together, they represented nearly half of the galaxy's military might, and controlled some of the most strategically important star systems in known space. Kane studied the defiant Council members with an expression that might have been sadness. Counselors, I had hoped we could accomplish this transition peacefully. Unfortunately, you seem determined to learn the hard way why resistance is futile. He activated his communication device, and new displays materialized around the chamber. These showed real-time tactical assessments from the territories controlled by the resistant Council species. What they revealed made even the most confident military commanders step backward in shock. The Zenthari homeworld was no longer just surrounded by human constructs. It was completely enveloped in a dimensional barrier that existed just outside normal space. Ships attempting to leave the planet simply disappeared, transported to holding areas in parallel dimensions. Incoming vessels found themselves redirected to empty space, their navigation systems somehow convinced they had reached their destinations, while actually arriving nowhere at all. Dimensional isolation, Kane explained matter-of-factly. Each resistant world is now contained within its own pocket of folded spacetime. You can see out, but you cannot leave. You can communicate with each other on the same world, but you cannot contact anyone beyond your dimensional bubble. Commander Zelta of the Ethereal Guard, whose species had chosen cooperation over resistance, watched the displays with something that might have been awe. How is this possible? The energy requirements alone should be astronomical if you use conventional physics, Kane agreed. But human technology doesn't operate on the same principles as yours. We learned long ago that it's more efficient to redefine reality than to overpower it. The displays updated to show the scope of the isolation effect. 5 Council species, hundreds of worlds, millions of ships, all suddenly cut off from the galactic community, as if they had never existed. Their territories appeared empty on all sensors. Their communications networks showed no activity. Their trade routes simply terminated at dimensional barriers that couldn't be crossed. Prime Adjudicator Roxas activated his personal combat systems, energy shields flaring around his crystalline form as weapon ports opened across his massive frame. If we are to be isolated, then we will make you regret your actions before we fall. He fired every weapon system he possessed simultaneously. Energy beams that could vaporize starships erupted from his armor, striking directly at Kane's position. The assembled aliens watched in fascination as the devastating attacks passed harmlessly through the human diplomat, as if he were nothing more than a hologram. Dimensional phase shifting, Kane explained calmly, apparently unaffected by the assault. I'm standing in the same space as you, but existing primarily in a parallel layer of reality. Your weapons can interact with my 3-dimensional projection. but they cannot reach my actual physical form. Theiss joined the attack, his Kythera bioweapons releasing clouds of nanoscale destroyers that should have reduced any organic matter to component atoms. The tiny machines swarmed around Kane's location but found nothing they could affect. He continued speaking as if millions of microscopic weapons weren't attempting to dismantle his molecular structure. This demonstrates the fundamental problem with your approach to galactic governance, Kane continued. You've become so accustomed to overwhelming force that you've forgotten there are other ways to resolve conflicts. The other Resistant Council members joined the assault, their combined might representing enough firepower to destroy small moons. Energy beams, gravity weapons, reality distortion fields, and exotic matter projectors all focused on Kane's position. The attacks created a light show that was visible from orbit, but the human diplomat remained completely unharmed. Your isolation will last exactly as long as your resistance, Kane announced over the chaos of weapons fire. The moment any of your species chooses cooperation over domination, the barriers around your territories will dissolve. Your people will be free to rejoin galactic civilization under the new Confederation principles. Roxas ceased firing, his weapon systems smoking from overuse. And if we choose permanent isolation? If we decide to rule our own territories according to our own principles, Kane's smile was both sad and understanding. Then you will rule empty territories, Counselor. Because your people, your citizens, your scientists, your artists, your philosophers, they all have choices to make as well. The displays shifted to show something that made the Resistant Council members step backward in shock. On every isolated world, human constructs were materializing within the dimensional barriers. But these weren't the geometric war machines that had surrounded the Council fleets. These were clearly diplomatic vessels, broadcasting messages in every local language and dialect. What are you doing? Theiss demanded, his mandibles clicking with agitation. Offering individual choice to every being in your territories, Kane replied. Each person, each community, each world will be given the opportunity to leave the isolation barriers if they choose. They can join the new Galactic Confederation, or they can remain with their traditional leaders. But the choice will be theirs, not yours. The implications hit the chamber like a physical blow. The council system had always been based on the assumption that entire species would follow their leaders' decisions. But if individual beings could choose their own allegiances, if communities could defect from their traditional governments, then the foundation of council authority would crumble. Already, the displays were showing the results of humanity's offer. On Zenthari Prime, entire cities were choosing to leave the dimensional barriers. Kythera hive clusters were fragmenting, as individual drones discovered they could think independently outside their leaders' control. Across the resistant territories, beings that had never been allowed to make their own choices were embracing the opportunity with enthusiasm that surprised even Kane. You're destroying the natural order, Vexa observed, though her tone suggested more curiosity than condemnation. We're revealing that the natural order was artificial, Kane corrected. Species don't naturally organize into rigid hierarchies with absolute leaders. That's something you impose through centuries of conditioning and control. Within hours, the isolated territories had become honeycombs of choice. Some regions remained loyal to their traditional leaders, accepting isolation in exchange for familiar authority. Others chose freedom and rejoined the galaxy under Confederation principles. Still others experimented with entirely new forms of government that blended traditional structures with individual liberty. This is what victory looks like, Kane told the assembled delegates. Not the defeat of enemies, but the liberation of potential. Not the imposition of our will, but the expansion of everyone's choices. Prime Adjudicator Roxas slumped in his throne, watching his empire fragment in real time. What happens now, human? What becomes of those who choose the old ways? Kane's expression softened. They live their lives according to their own principles, Counselor. Freedom includes the freedom to choose hierarchy, to prefer order over chaos, to value tradition over innovation. The only thing that changes is that it becomes a choice rather than an obligation. 1 year later, Ambassador David Kane stood in the same Grand Assembly Hall, but everything had changed. The crystalline walls still stretched toward infinity, but now they pulsed with patterns representing hundreds of different species, rather than just the dominant 12. The tiered seating was filled with delegates from civilizations that had never been permitted to speak in this chamber before, former client species, newly independent worlds and entirely new governments that had emerged from the fragments of the old order. The Council of 12 no longer existed. In its place sat the Confederation Assembly, with representatives chosen by voluntary association rather than imposed authority. Some were familiar faces. Councillor Vexa of the Ethereals had become an advocate for energy-based life forms, while Commander Zelta now led peacekeeping operations across the galaxy. Others were completely new, beings whose species had been suppressed for so long that the galaxy had forgotten they existed. Kane watched the proceedings with satisfaction as delegate after delegate rose to address the assembly. The Murthak, whose artistic abilities had been channeled solely into propaganda for their former Zenthari overlords, now shared cultural exchanges with dozens of species. The Volanti, who had been modified into living computers by the Kethera, had rediscovered their capacity for original thought and were contributing breakthrough discoveries in quantum mathematics. Prime Adjudicator Roxas, no longer holding that title, but still commanding respect as elder representative of the traditional Zenthari, approached Kane during a recess in the proceedings. The massive alien's crystalline form had lost much of its earlier luminescence, but his bearing suggested acceptance rather than defeat. "I owe you an apology." "Human," Roxas said, his voice carrying harmonics of something that might have been humility. "When you first stood in this chamber, I believed you were just another species seeking power. I did not understand that you were offering something far more dangerous." Kane raised an eyebrow. "Dangerous?" "Hope," Roxas replied simply. "Power can be countered with greater power. Military might can be overcome with superior strategy. But hope? Hope changes everything. It makes beings believe they can become more than they are." The two stood together, watching as a young delegate from the former Kethera territories addressed the assembly. The being had once been part of a hive mind, her thoughts controlled by genetic programming that prioritized collective needs over individual desires. Now she spoke passionately about establishing educational exchanges between species, her individual personality shining through in ways that would have been impossible under the old system. "The traditional Zenthari territories remain voluntarily isolated," Roxas continued. "About 30% of our people chose to maintain the old ways. We rule ourselves according to ancient principles, and we are content." Kane nodded. "Content is a valid choice, Elder Representative. Not everyone needs to embrace change. But the other 70%, Roxas paused, his harmonics shifting to frequencies Kane had learned to recognize as wonder. "They have become things I never imagined possible. Zenthari artists, philosophers, explorers. Some have joined human research expeditions into parallel dimensions. Others are establishing entirely new colonies based on principles that blend our traditional hierarchy with individual expression." The assembly session resumed, and Kane watched as species after species reported on developments that would have been impossible under council rule. The hegemony's former slave populations had established democratic collectives that were revolutionizing agricultural techniques. Ex-Kethera drones were forming voluntary hive minds based on shared interest rather than genetic compulsion. Even some void walkers had emerged from their dimensional isolation to participate in the Confederation's exploration initiatives. During the final session of the day, Kane was called to address the assembly. He rose from his position among the human delegation, a group that now included representatives from 17 different dimensional layers where human civilization had expanded, and walked to the central speaking platform. "Delegates of the Galactic Confederation," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. "1 year ago I stood in this hall and declared war on the galaxy. Today I want to explain why that war was necessary, and why it will never end." A murmur of confusion ran through the assembled beings. Many had assumed that humanity's conflict with the old order was finished. "The war we declared was not against any species or government," Kane continued. "It was against the idea that some beings are inherently superior to others. Against the belief that progress requires oppression. Against the assumption that order can only be maintained through control." He gestured to the diverse assembly before him. "This war will never end because there will always be those who seek to dominate others. There will always be civilizations that believe their way is the only way. There will always be beings who mistake power for wisdom." The displays around the chamber updated to show real-time images from across the galaxy, Most showed peaceful cooperation and remarkable progress, species working together on projects that none could have accomplished alone, civilizations sharing technologies and cultures in ways that enriched everyone involved. But some images showed darker developments. The Zerathi Dominion, emerging from beyond the galactic rim, believes that biological life is inferior to synthetic consciousness, Kane noted, indicating one set of images. The transcendent collective seeks to absorb all species into a single unified mind. The Purity Alliance advocates for the elimination of genetic diversity through forced evolution. These were new threats, civilizations that had emerged or revealed themselves only after the Council's fall. Each represented a different form of the same fundamental problem, the belief that one group's vision of perfection should be imposed on everyone else. Humanity's role in this confederation is not to rule or to guide, Kane announced. Our role is to ensure that choice remains available to all beings. When new dominators arise, we will oppose them. When old forms of oppression resurface, we will counter them. When anyone seeks to impose their will on unwilling populations, we will offer alternatives. Elder Representative Roxas stepped forward from the traditional Zenthari delegation. And if some of us choose systems that others consider oppressive, if beings voluntarily accept hierarchy or uniformity, Kane smiled, then those choices will be protected as vigorously as any others, Elder Representative. The right to choose includes the right to choose structures that limit future choices, as long as the initial decision is made freely. A new delegate rose from the assembly floor, Representative Mira of the New Kithara Consciousness, a collective that had formed when former hive drones discovered they could maintain mental connections while preserving individual thought. What of those who regret their choices? What of communities that discover their decisions led to suffering? Then they will have the opportunity to choose again, Kane replied. Freedom is not a one-time decision. It is an ongoing process of growth, learning, and adaptation. The Confederation exists to ensure that process continues. As the session concluded, Kane reflected on the transformation that had occurred. The galaxy was messier now, more chaotic, less predictable than it had been under Council rule. Conflicts arose between species with different values. Economic systems competed and sometimes failed, and some civilizations made choices that led to genuine hardship, but it was also more alive than it had ever been. Species that had been stagnant for millennia were experiencing rapid cultural evolution. Technologies that had been suppressed were revolutionizing entire sectors of galactic civilization. Art, music, literature, and philosophy were flourishing as beings discovered they could express ideas that had been forbidden for thousands of years. The war humanity had declared on the galaxy was not a war of conquest or destruction. It was a war for the right of every being to determine their own destiny. And as Kane looked out at the diverse assembly of free peoples, he knew that this war was worth fighting forever. The age of imposed order was over. The age of chosen chaos had begun. And across 7 dimensions of reality, human guardians continued their eternal vigil, ensuring that freedom would always have defenders when dominators arose. Victory had not come through defeating enemies, but through helping everyone discover they had choices they never knew existed.